Okay, it looks like we may have an intimate crowd today, but we're going to go ahead and do this. And like I said, we'll record this session so that we can put it up on the web for folks to look at later. I'd like to welcome Carlos Diaz with the Capabilities and Requirements Decision Support Group, or CaRDS. If you've ever found yourself saying, you know, I think that we ought to do such and such, then this is going to be the new process by which we get buy-in from from headquarters and how it gets supported and how we make that possible. So Carlos is going to walk us through that. Just as a reminder, make sure that if you are trying to mute your phone, make sure you mute it and do not put it on hold, or we're going to get your NOAA weather radio. With that, thank you very much, and we'll give it to Carlos.
Okay, thank you, Larry. So let me hide the screen here. Not the screen, the go-to webinar information. All right, so I'll go ahead and start. First, I do want to thank those of you who are on for taking an hour or so of your time to sit in and participate. And with that, I'll go ahead and get started. CaRDS is a process within our new governance structure for acquiring and validating field requirements. CaRDS is managed by AFS under the Analysis and Mission Support Division. We also have a CaRDS site, or a CaRDS tool, which provides information, documentation, templates, and the status for all the requests that are in the system. And it's also the means to upload or submit new requests. And I can give a demonstration of that later towards the end. Starting up front, CaRDS is not OSIP. We want CaRDS and it's designed to be lighter, whereas before the submitter had to prepare all kinds of documents, including concepts of operations, operational requirements, a project plan, and so forth. We're much lighter. We start with one simple form, and you will see what that looks like later. It's inclusive. Anyone in the Weather Service can submit a request. And we want it to be both transparent and responsive. So we will show the status of all the requests and upload and show the decisions made at every step of the way. And that includes informing folks what those decisions are. So if a particular request, for example, is not accepted, we will inform everyone down the chain all the way down to the originator of that decision. It is both strategic and fiscally linked in that we want to align CaRDS requests with strategic goals and AOP processes when resources are not available. And when there are, we want to align them with resources early on in the process. It is accountable in the sense that the requirements are ultimately validated by the new Mission Delivery Council. And that's a great thing because the MDC does incorporate all of the regions. And at the bottom there, we show that it's integrated because we do have deliberate coordination between the Mission Delivery Council and the Portfolio Integration Council, since they will be the ones who address solution space in which service delivery portfolio is to carry out the request and develop it. I keep talking about requests, and that is because we would basically want to call anything coming in a request regardless of how the user may consider it, whether it be a need, a request, an idea, or opportunity. Generically, we're going to call them all requests until such time as it is validated as a requirement. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the request originator can be anyone, and that includes internal or external folks. If it's an external entity, they will go through their Weather Service point of contact, who would actually fill out the form and submit the request on their behalf. And there are a couple of examples there on the bottom of the slide. So when does a request become a requirement? Well, a validated field requirement is a request which one has been deemed appropriate and applicable to the organization. So that means, does it fit within our mission or strategic documentation? Number two, does it provide benefit? We want to make sure that although it's a good idea, that it will be beneficial such that it's worth spending the resources to make it happen. And finally, is it validated by the Mission Delivery Council? So once they validate a request, or approve a request, I should say, we now have a validated requirement. There's a note there, and I'll talk a lot more about it later, the fact that we still do have the 10102 process, and that is the process by which we put out experimental products or services for review and comment and before going operational. So that will still take place. And this is another area that I'll talk to in more detail in a few slides. Before we get to the CaRDS and how it fits within the Weather Service, I want to just very quickly touch on the new councils because I'm not sure if everyone is aware or familiar with them. We start with the Executive Council, and that's chaired by the AA. And basically, things will go to the Executive Council if they need a higher level decision because of either high impact, high visibility, or transformational change. The Mission Delivery Council, which is chaired by the OO, and you can see under the members there that it does include all the regions, the centers, AFS, and the COO himself. They're the ones who would actually validate and prioritize those field requirements. The Portfolio Integration Council, which is comprised of a regional director and basically all the other service delivery portfolios, they ensure integration across the portfolios as far as where solutions should lie and basically integrate the left side of the organization with the right side of the organization. And finally, the Enterprise Risk Council, chaired by the DAA, they basically would identify and address enterprise risks and issues. So if there's something that is large and needs to be addressed by the Enterprise Risk Council, we will bring it up to them. And bottom line is they would approve mitigation strategies to deal with enterprise risks. So now let's go ahead and talk about CaRDS. And here's a high-level process for getting a request validated. There are 4 tiers involved. Tier 1 is basically validated by a designated submitter. We have asked all the regions and all the offices to name designated submitters. So at Tier 1, I'll walk you through an example. Let's say I work at a WFO and I have this great idea. I will fill out the request, run it by my manager to make sure that they agree, and then that is forwarded to the designated submitter for my region. The designated submitter would then look at that document, and if he or she approves it, the designated submitter would submit it into the CaRDS system, and that would complete Tier 1 approval. At Tier 2 is where a lot of the work happens, and that's where many of the folks on this call may be engaged, and that is where the service program team conducts their review and approval decisions. Every national service program within AFS has a corresponding service program team. So the service program teams play a big role in coordinating that request among all the regions and applicable centers and offices to make sure that it captures what we need, to make sure that the scope is well defined. And for example, should this be for one region only or all regions? And they would make a approval recommendation. The service program team's focus is not so much on the solution that may be provided with that request, but actually what is the underlying requirement associated with what's being asked? Do we approve that requirement? If the service program team approves it, then it goes to Tier 3, and that's at the AFS director level. The AFS director, again, looks at it and definitely paints it with a big brush that looks at policy impacts and also corporate benefit. And he or she may approve and validate it if it's strictly within the AFS portfolio. But for most requests that are not within the AFS portfolio, they would in fact go from the AFS director to the Mission Delivery Council for validation. The Mission Delivery Council looks at the request, and if they approve it, it would be either forwarded to the Portfolio Integration Council or to the AFS portfolio if it's contained within the AFS portfolio. At this point, the Portfolio Integration Council has a request, and we also place it at the same time in what we call a prioritized queue of requests, and you'll see that in a minute. I want to highlight a couple of things here. At any tier, if a request is not approved, the originator, the designator, or a major stakeholder can appeal, and the appeal is done by addressing it at the next tier up. So, for example, if the AFS director does not approve a request, the originator may appeal to the Mission Delivery Council. The thick red arrow going back down is basically just to indicate that both non-approved as well as status and feedback is provided all the way down to the originator at every stage or every tier. Here's how CaRDS looks like in the larger organizational context. Starting with the bottom right, the NIDO request is submitted and then goes through tiers 1 through 3. At Tier 2, we do encourage coordination and consultation by the SPTs with the service delivery portfolios. This is to either get a better feel for what the nature of the request is, but also to check whether or not something like this is already in the works. We want to try to catch things that can be either accomplished together or prevent a request going through if it turns out that someone's already working on that. Assuming it's approved through tiers 1 through 3, then it goes to the Mission Delivery Council. And they may engage policy if necessary, but assuming that they approve the request, then it follows the solid arrow where it says field requirements over to the Portfolio Integration Council, and it is also put on that prioritized queue of requirements. The dashed arrows indicate the fact that from the Mission Delivery Council, they may need to engage a CFO, or if it's a high visibility, high risk, or transformational change, they may need to engage the Executive Council and or the Risk Mitigation Council. That's what those arrows represent. Assuming success-driven, once at the Portfolio Integration Council, that's where they really look at the trade space. Where would this reside? Who would develop the capability? Who's going to own it and maintain it and provide O&M? They may also develop a business case for the particular request if contracts or funding is required. And they also do the project management solution definition and execution with the appropriate service delivery portfolio. Once that's done, then finally it gets implemented and available to the field and the rest of the world. So who do we have working to make CaRDS go? I started by mentioning we do have designated submitters, and they represent both the field as well as the offices, and their approval basically completes Tier 1. The service program teams, they do their coordination, and their approval will complete Tier 2, and they prepare what we call a validation decision package for Tier 3. It's basically the request and another form that ensures that coordination has taken place. It also captures the SPT member votes, as well as any issues that may be important for Tier 3 to consider in their evaluation. Something new here is we also have what are called the AFS1 corporate project teams. And they basically do the same role as the service program team, but they do not fall directly under one of the national service programs. And we have CPTs in IDSS, Impacts Catalog, Ecological Forecasting, and the National Blend of Models. And then finally, Product and Services Change Management, 10102. You may notice that's a new name. It used to be New or Enhanced Products or Services. We changed the name because we now want new products or services to come into CaRDS, so I didn't want it to look like there were two different systems. 10102 will still do the coordination and overseeing the process for putting out experimental products, and then coordinate the transitioning of those from experimental products into operations. The notes there, we already have Note 1 accomplished, and that is we have field FMCs who've identified subject matter experts to participate on the SPT teams. SPT membership does include NOAA advisors. And finally, requirements leads are to be identified from within the portfolio offices to help support that requirements effort. We're still working on item 3 there. Although there are several SPTs who do in fact have service delivery portfolio members from STI and so forth, just as an FYI. So going through the process in detail, the originator would download the new mission NIDO request template that's available on the website and fill it out. They would then run it by their manager, and if it is approved, the manager would send it to the designated submitter. So there's a note there, the manager should consider applicability and appropriateness for the weather service, whether or not they are aware of something else already in the works which may basically indicate that that the request either needs to be merged into that effort or is no longer needed. We want them to also look at policy as well as a benefit to the organization as a whole. The designated submitter would do the same thing at the FMC level. We want them to look at again, ensure that this is consistent with both national as well as regional policy. And again, the designated submitter may be aware of a similar effort in the works, and so it's another opportunity to catch that and prevent duplication of efforts. But that will complete Tier 1, submission by the designated submitter. This is a note which is helpful to folks planning to submit something. We do encourage the originator to reach out to program leads and focal points as they prepare that request. We want to make sure the request captures and clearly indicates a mission gap and basically the proposed requirement, not necessarily focus on the solution. Although there are many times when it's really hard to separate the two, we still want them to say, okay, if you want to update this particular product, what is the requirement that we want to fulfill, rather than how we get that product updated, as an example. And I say there that the request may mention a proposed solution, but we have to understand that an alternate solution may be determined after the requirement is validated by the PIC and the service delivery portfolios. They may identify that, for example, in order to make this happen on a national scale, we need to be able to develop that capability, whether it be in CP or IDP or some other part of the organization. Tier 2, as I mentioned, is where the service program teams conduct their review. We want meetings, typically they're going to be held via teleconference, and so the goal there is to address the request, identify any issues, and obtain a decision from all the members. And the idea is to make sure that we focus on what will it take to validate the requirement. So the focus is on the decision for requirement validation. The SPT does complete that validation decision document for Tier 3 for his information, and that would complete Tier 2. I have a couple of notes there. Typically, more than one service, more than one SPT or CPT may be engaged in reviewing in the review process. And also, if the SPT looks at the request and doesn't really foresee any issues, that review and coordination and even the vote may take place via email rather than waiting for a formal sit-together meeting. A couple of more details regarding that SPT and Tier 2. As I mentioned, if a request may be approved by the SPT, but they may also not approve it. For example, the service program team may determine that that request violates public-private sector policy. So in that case, they would not approve it. We want to make sure that they capture the rationale, and that information is still provided to AFSO at Tier 3 for situational awareness. But if it's not approved by the SPT, the request stops there at Tier 2 as not approved. And the CaRDS analyst will update the information and notify both the submitter and the originator. In the review process, if any SPT member has an opposing view or a vote, that is also captured and made available at Tier 3 for situational awareness. As well as, I mentioned earlier, not approved requests may be elevated to Tier 3 by either the originator, the designated submitter, or even one of the SPT members themselves may elevate that. Additional detail regarding voting. Every team member is to represent their office, region, or center. And we want to make sure that members know that they have the responsibility to report up as necessary appropriate information so that their vote doesn't just represent that person's opinion, but basically it represents the office, region, or center they're in. Members should consider the corporate benefit, not just whether or not it applies to the specific program office or region. So if I'm in a particular region and a request comes in and it's for a type of product or service that we do not use in this region, I should still consider, well, how beneficial will this be for the rest of the weather service, not just my region, when making that vote. And most service program teams will have multiple members from the same FMC, and but each FMC basically has one vote. So, for example, if AFS has 3 persons on the team, there is 1 vote for AFS. So if the members from the same office do not agree, they need to coordinate and resolve that difference before they submit that final vote. At Tier 3, the director addresses a request, and there are several options available at that point. Number 1 is to approve the request and then present it to the Mission Delivery Council. Option 2 will be to approve and validate the requirement, provided that it's something which can be accomplished within the AFS portfolio. And finally, the director may not approve the request. The notes there are to indicate that both requests which are approved and validated by AFS, as well as not approved, that information does go to the Mission Delivery Council for their situational awareness as well. The Mission Delivery Council addresses their request and then forwards it to the Portfolio Integration Council or AFS, as shown in the previous diagram. After Tier 4, the validated requirements are placed in our prioritized queue of requirements, as I mentioned before, and forwarded to the Portfolio Integration Council. We want, at that point, the PIC to coordinate their trade space discussion prior to defining a solution. So that entails, okay, where might this reside and who is likely to develop the capability? And as I mentioned before, the request may include a potential or a proposed solution, but basically the PIC and the service delivery portfolios, they're the ones who ultimately decide on what the final solution is and are not necessarily bound to the proposed solution that's provided with the request. So we want the service delivery portfolios to be engaged after the PIC addresses the validated requirement, and they may produce a business case if necessary, or proceed with the rest of the solution definition and execution. We do want both the Mission Delivery Council and the Portfolio Integration Council to periodically review that queue of prioritized requests and re-rack and stack as needed. Because we do foresee that many requests are going to come into the PIC, and they're going to say, we don't have resources. We're going to have to look at whether or not this can be considered for a future year, either AOP, milestone, or a milestone. And so those things will remain in that prioritized queue, but we definitely want them to be revisited. We anticipate that the MDC will review that quarterly, and we haven't determined or haven't been told yet how often the PIC will do the same thing. But bottom line there is requirements are in the queue, and the PIC has not been able to assign resources to it. Those are basically great candidates for future year AOP. So I keep talking about the request, so let's look at what's in there. And in that original need or requirement request that is filled out, it's relatively simple. We ask for originator contact information, a statement of the actual need, what is it that's being requested. There is an opportunity to identify whether or not there's any time sensitivity and areas to address operational gaps, as well as linkages to strategic drivers or mandates, and also an area for the benefits. There's also an opportunity to select the National Service Program team under which the applicable request is, the request applies, I should say, and also an opportunity to put in a rough order of magnitude estimate for what they believe is going to be required. And in that section, one can also address potential solutions. So this is a snapshot of what that document looks like. And as you can tell, it's 2 pages, 3 pages with the instructions. And it's a lot simpler than what we were asking for in previous version, OSIP, bottom line. And even the sections for strategic drivers and benefits, we've added some teaser questions to help fill out that section. And as I said before, in the estimated resource needs, that's where one may include a proposed solution. There is a note there that the validation of the requirement for this request does not imply approval of the proposed solution. and that's because the real solution analysis will take place after the request is handed over to the PIC. So a quick recap. It doesn't mean we're done. There's a whole other section coming up. CaRDS is a governance process for validating field requirements. Requests are validated and evaluated for their applicability and appropriateness. In other words, should this be a validated requirement? Tier 2 and the regional members do play a key role in documenting and coordinating that requirement and the request. And a validated requirement is basically the go-ahead for developing the necessary capability. With that asterisk, which indicates that it does not imply that if a requirement is validated, that does not imply that we have the resources. So again, in that case, it will be placed in that prioritized queue. But what about 10.102? I mentioned 10.102 still exists, and there is some tight integration between the two. We still need to evaluate and provide for comment and review of new products and services before they can go operational. As I mentioned before, the process is now called Products and Services Change Management. Another change is the SPTs and the CPTs replace what used to be the cross-agency review team in the evaluation of experimental products. So what else is new? Well, right now the way we do it is if a person proposes a new or enhanced experimental product or service, it starts as a CaRDS request. The idea there is we want to make sure that it goes through that evaluation of is this a valid requirement? Do we agree with the scope and the proposed solution? So there are some benefits to going through that. It's an early check, as I mentioned, for whether or not it's a valid requirement. It also allows folks here to check and provide guidance if necessary with respect to policy impacts. It's transparent in that it quickly is made visible to all the regions so they can put in their impacts or scope statements. And it also helps address the national versus regional versus local use very early on. This kind of helps with what we've seen many times with the old 10.102 process, in that someone would submit a request for a particular product that they thought would apply to either a very specific WFO or area or a region, only to find out later that other regions would benefit, and in fact it should be national versus regional. So it helps catch that early on. And it also provides feedback and suggestions that can improve that final product or service. The idea of getting that request approved first is still consistent with even the old 10.102 policy, which basically said when you prototype, put it in 10.102 to get that coordination done. So we're doing the same thing, but we're basically doing it via CaRDS now. So in order to propose a new experimental product or service, it is submitted in CaRDS for, number one, validation of the requirement, coordination across the regions, kind of catch whether or not something's already being done or in the works to mitigate duplication of efforts. Once it's validated, then we go ahead and proceed with the development and any necessary 10.102 PSEM coordination. So the bottom line is we want to start by getting that requirement validated, then proceed or complete necessary development. The reason why I state complete is because more often than not, an experimental product that's being proposed is a result of some development that's already been done, and we want to leverage that. For existing experimental products, there are many of those out there that have been out for comment and review. When the experimental comment is complete, the PSEM team, and PSEM and 10.102 are synonymous basically, they will coordinate the review and decision process for what to do with that experimental product, whether it be to extend the comment period, transition to operational, or to discontinue it. In that case, PSEM will first do their review and policy checks, and then engage the service program teams for their evaluation. If it is a national product, it still will continue to be evaluated for approval by AFS, just as we have before. And I mentioned there at the bottom line that the PSEM folks will work with the originator to prepare that approval package for experimental products. That includes the notification, the PDD, and so forth. So let's talk about some 10102 examples. So let's say we have first a request that did go through CARD. It is approved as a validated requirement, goes to the PIC. They hand it off to, for example, central processing, who goes ahead and develops the capability, and they believe it's now ready to be implemented. In that case, we want the developer to inform us that it's complete and ready for test or implementation. Then we engage the SPT for their review process of whether or not it is, in fact, ready to go out as an experimental product. If it's national, that review includes Tier 3 approval. After that, we go ahead and put it out as an experimental product. That means it gets posted. We send out the notification and so forth. And then at the end of the comment period, it comes back to the PSCM, who coordinates with the SPT to transition from experimental to operational. Now, what happens if we have a request and someone says, oh, I've already developed this thing and I want permission to go experimental? Well, we still need to go through CARDS because that's the way to submit the request. And so during that phase, we still look at, do we really have a requirement to provide this capability? Is it appropriate and applicable to the Weather Service? And consider the method by which this thing will be generated. So, for example, if I develop a new product which is running on a server within my region, the question is this the right home for how that product gets generated, especially if it's going to be considered for national use? It may be determined that no, that server is not supported 24/7, so we in fact would need to have it in IDP or CP or some other organization. So if in that case Tier 2 or 3 does not approve their request, development effort would have been wasted. So that kind of highlights why it's important to start with a CARDS request. If it is approved and the solution is acceptable, meaning it truly was ready for experimental comment and review, we'll go ahead and put it out as such. But if it is approved and it's determined that, well, we really need an alternate solution, the case being, for example, where it really can't reside on a regional server forever because there's no O&M guarantee or no 24/7 support, then it would still, at that point, it would continue through CARDS to the PIC so they can develop the final solution. So the bottom line is this highlights the need to first put in the request, have that requirement validated, then proceed with development. Otherwise, we run the risk of some development effort being wasted or an alternate solution being determined to be more feasible. This kind of highlights the same thing, but in a pictorial diagram. Using the bottom half is what I call the old school path, where someone says, I've already developed this product. It goes into a CARDS request, gets reviewed at Tier 1 and Tier 3. So the first check is this an appropriate requirement? If the answer is no, for example, it might violate public-private sector policy, then that effort that had already taken place to develop the product would have been wasted. If it is approved and then it's determined that the solution is not appropriate because, for example, it needs to be developed within IDP for national support, then again, some of that development time would have been wasted. Whereas going through the path on the top side there, starting with CARDS and getting that approval, then we can proceed with development and so forth. So it's a different way of looking at the same information as the previous slide. So what are our next steps? Continue using CARDS. We have 23 requests in the system right now. Governance 2.0 documentation is in the works and will be completed shortly. And that does include specifics about CARDS for field requirements validation process. We've provided that information to them. We still need to write the procedural directive for CARDS, and that identifies all the specific activities and responsibilities. And we also need to rewrite 10102 to address the CARDS engagement, the service program teams versus the cross-agency review team, and so forth. So at this point, I'd like to stop for questions.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Appreciate it. Are there any questions for Carlos on the CARDS process? Okay, well, none heard. We'll go ahead and close out this edition of Fire on the Fives.
I'm sorry, if you don't mind, I'd like to give a quick demonstration on the site.
Oh, absolutely. Go ahead, Carlos.
I'm going to send, I'll send out both the URL and a copy of the presentation so you can have it on hand. This is the CARDS site. It is for internal use, so in order to access it, you will be prompted to enter in a username and password. Use your email username and password without @NOAA.gov to access. The site starts with a snapshot, including all requests so far and where they are at within the tiers. It also lists all of the requests, and you may click on any one of them to get additional information about that request. And that includes details on the originator, the submitter, as well as information on every tier, the decision, the date, and any notes associated with the request. It also includes links for documents with that request. So there's a lot of information available there for those who need to know more about a specific request. Up on top, we have general information. The first includes templates, and that's well, the first one here will be the actual request template for a new mission, need, or requirement. It also has a template for use by the service program teams, although typically they do not need to download this because we, CARDS analysts, do pre-fill out that template and provide it to them. But it's there if someone wants to see what kinds of information is being asked. Under CARDS info, we have the overview. We have the CARDS 101, which is what you just saw. And here is also lists of all the service program teams, the corporate project teams, and clicking on any of them will show you their composition, who the members are. There's also, for those who like big lists, one huge list that indicates all of them in one page. And that's more applicable to a particular office, I should say a particular region or center who may want to find out who all of their representatives are within the CARDS SPTs. Under other resources, this is primarily to help out folks filling out the request. We have information about governance, access to the NWS and NOAA strategic plan documents, as well as DOC. And we also have information on the Weather Ready Nation site, and these are all links to those particular sites, including the President's Climate Action Plan for climate-related activities. In Submit Your Request is where the designated submitter will go to actually submit a request. Again, we have the link to that document just to make it easier to find it. This is just a one-pager with detailed steps for submitting the request. But basically, if I were an originator and I have a request which I want to submit, not a lot is required. They sign into this site and click on Submit Request. By virtue of the fact that I signed into the site, the system has already captured my name, and then we do an LDAP lookup to obtain office information, email, and phone number. So trying to make it as easy as possible. Although LDAP is not always current, they may fix, the submitter can edit both the office and the phone number, but they cannot edit the name or their email address. And that's for security and making sure we don't try to sneak one in under someone else's name. But once they sign in, as I mentioned, this is pre-populated. They will click Choose File. And again, I apologize for the delay on this computer. So they will click on Choose File, select the request that they want to submit. I'm going to almost do it. And then at that point, click Submit Request. That's all that is needed to submit a request. The section here at the bottom are optional, and that's if they want to provide comments related to what they're submitting, or if there's an additional file they want to include with that submission, they can do that. But it's not required, it's not necessary. So literally all I have to do, as I mentioned, was sign in, choose the file, and hit Submit Request. Now I'm not going to submit it because I don't want a dummy request in the system, so I'll go ahead and cancel and go back. Of course, it's warning me that I'm about to lose all that information, and that's okay in this case. And finally, under the report section, it's just basically different ways of cutting and dicing the data that's in there. So the first one is listing all the requests, which is very similar to what was on that first page, but they're all in easier to read format. We have requests listed by the status or their tier, by CaRDS analysts, and here's a good one that is applicable to service program teams. It shows the service program teams and other requests that they're looking at any time. We also have a list of those which have been validated, and finally a list of requests which are in the prioritized queue. This will include priority in the date that the PIC addressed it, as well as for things that stay in there, the date of their last review. But we haven't had the PIC look at these yet, so there's no information for those. No additional information, I should say, for those. And feel free to go to the site and poke around, and if you have any comments or questions about it, don't hesitate to ask me. And the same holds true for the CaRDS process in general. If there are any comments or questions that you have, feel free to reach out via email, and I'll try to address those as best I can. And again, any other questions?
Hi, I have a question for Robin, if she's on.
I am.
Or Larry. Hey, is this, and I might have missed the first part, is this going to be available, this recorded, this webinar?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep, we'll put it on the Google Sites page.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Well, thank you, Carlos, very much for going through this. One of the reasons we wanted to host this topic as a Fire on the Fives is that we want to make sure that the field understands the CaRDS process, in particular understands that you in the field can start a CaRDS document for an idea that you have in your office, sub-regionally, in your region, whatever. You can begin this process yourself and forward it up through this chain that that Carlos had mentioned. So it's kind of a very documented way for you to try to create some change from your level in the organization, which is great. And anybody at any level in the organization can start this process to start creating this chain. And regardless of where you are in the organization, it is vetted out through all areas through the service program team. So we do have a couple documents in the works that Heath is working on, and so we will be submitting them shortly into the CaRDS process. This will conclude today's version of Fire on the Fives. I did want to mention that we are going to do a special version of Fire on the Fives on the 15th of this month, which is Monday, August 15th at 1 p.m. And we're going to do that, devote that to the new SPOT webpage. We want to make sure that all offices and forecasters are prepared for the SPOT transition to the new SPOT webpage, and we just want to make an opportunity to have our SPOT developers on the line and you guys to ask questions. So that will be our next call, and we'll be sending out information to register for that via email. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you all very much. Yes, thank you, Robin, and thank you to everyone on the line. I appreciate you taking your time.
Thanks, Carlos.
Thank you.